See if we can adjust this just a little bit. All right. All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I feel like starting my day off with a praise, starting this broadcast off with a praise. And let's see where we go from there. I just want to love you more. I just want to love you more. I just want to love you more than yesterday. I just want to love you more. I just want to love you more. I just want to love you more than yesterday. Well, I'm so glad to be in the land of the living. And we are back with our book talk for today. This is Reflections on Race, Day 25. And we are continuing in the book White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Dr. Tim Wise. Yesterday, we looked at the significance that journalism plays in framing and shaping the conversation around the nation concerning race and concerning identity. Tim Wise, at this point in the reading, 9/11 has just happened, and he and his fellow colleagues have decided to take a stand as to how they would report on 9/11 and not buy into the stereotypes that several outlets were wanting them to partake of in regards to the Muslim community at the time. And so he does a lot of, yesterday we talked about how the journalists, in a sense, rebelled against the agenda of just targeting Muslims to report on and to ask them how they felt about 9/11. The journalists of his day were unwilling to foster a stereotype or to try to go after one particular people group because that's what their news outlets wanted them to do. So that's actually encouraging and good to know. However, in the current day, in the current society, many people are lamenting that anti-media has become so popular. But the reason it's become so popular is that regular media outlets, or mainstream media, or MSM as it is shortened, has been so distrustful lately in the kind of information that they have been bringing has been very one-sided or very biased. So a lot of people, especially since this election cycle, have really lost faith in the sincerity and in the truthfulness of journalism, because they realize that a lot of it has been people who have been paid to come in and give a slanted perspective. And anytime you do that, you impugn the very nature of, you bring into question the very nature of the journalism practice and field. There's supposed to be a certain code of ethics that journalists follow, which has not been followed. Journalists aren't supposed to be going online attacking other journalists. That hasn't been followed. Journalists aren't supposed to be attacking people's racial groups. That hasn't been followed. Journalists are not supposed to be, racially attacking, just random people. So it makes it, and when I say that, I'm not just talking about like their personal Twitter account or anything like that. I'm talking about using their television space, which has happened in many cases, using their social media page for the station or for the company to attack people groups. That is what is happening. That is somewhat unethical. So people are fed up with that. They want clean journalism. They want ethical journalism. They want to, believe in some respect that you are able to give an unbiased and distorted opinion about whatever news that you're reporting. So that's where we jump in today with our reading, what has happened after 9/11, and Tim is going to take us from there. And today's reading, it appears to be, looks like we're going to get through it today. Not going to be too long. All right, so here we go. And we'll get the vocal cords warmed up here. All right. Unable to return home by plane, as flights remained grounded through the end of the week due to 9/11, Heidi rented a car and asked if I wanted to share the ride. Having no better plan as to how I might get home, I agreed. I would take her to her house in Montgomery and then drive the rest of the way to Nashville, dropping the rental off there. All the way home, it was apparent that the nation was headed into full froth revenge mode. Callers to one after another talk show, and not just on right-wing radio, demanded massive retaliation and even the use of nuclear weapons against Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, whomever. Many callers weren't discriminating. They were prepared without hesitation to turn the Middle East, in their words, into a parking lot. Of course, excuse me, calls for racial and religious profiling were heard everywhere, with very few willing to challenge the position in those first few weeks. It was only rational to profile Arabs and Muslims, most folks insisted, since they were the ones who posed the greatest threat. That no similar calls for the racial profiling of whites had been issued after Timothy McVeigh's crime. All right, we're having a little bit of problems here with our Periscope, so let's see if we can get it to close and restart. Thank you for your patience. All right, so let me read that last sentence again. And we're talking about Tim Wise's experience after 9/11. It was only rational to profile Arabs and Muslims, most folks insisted, since they were the ones who posed the greatest threat. That no similar calls for racial profiling of whites had been issued after Timothy McVeigh's crime, or those of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, or the Olympic Park bomber, Eric Rudolph, or the dozens of abortion clinic bombers and arsonists over the years, all of whom had been white and ostensibly Christian, went largely unmentioned. That Al-Qaeda operated in more than 50 nations, and that the physical presence of persons from those nations ran the gamut from lily white skin to the Chechen rebels, to the olive color of most Indonesians and Filipinos, to the blue-black of the Sudanese, and thus profiling was an almost Sisyphean task, regardless of the ethics of the matter, was even less important, it seemed. Immediately, I could notice the difference during my travels. Anyone who looked even remotely Arab or just brown was searched more intently than anyone else. Like the family of 5 named Martinez, who were headed from Nashville to Guadalajara, Mexico, during the last week in September, and who were given the red alert treatment from security. I was about to say something to the officials when they finally let the family go. After contending themselves that the infant's diaper bag was not an incendiary device, and that the Spanish they were speaking was not some form of coded Arabic. The only thing more maddening than the calls for profiling or violence was the way in which whites seemed so oblivious to why anyone might have attacked the United States in the first place. Why do they hate us became a commonly heard question asked by folks when they would be interviewed by news crews across the country. But not one of the persons who saw this query, and I saw it hundreds of times if I saw it once, was of color. Not one. Yet no one seemed to notice the monochromatic nature of the naivety, or if they didn't think it interesting enough to remark upon. The lack of inquisitiveness on the part of folks of color as to why anyone might hate America wasn't due to insensitivity, of course. It surely wasn't because they were any less horrified by the slaughter of 3,000 innocent people or any less scared about the future attacks. But to be black and brown is to know that there is and there are reasons to feel less than giddy about the United States. It is to have a love-hate relationship with the nation. Only whites have the luxury of thinking the world sees us as we see us, and that the United States has been a force for unparalleled and uninterrupted good, doing nothing around the globe that could possibly explain America hatred, the likes of which we discovered on the fateful day of 9/11. But people of color know that things have been a bit more complicated, that terrorism isn't new, that innocent people have been targeted before, and by the very same empire that now seem to believe it have been victimized in ways never before seen in human history. People of color have never had the luxury of believing the national fairy tales upon which white Americans have come to depend. The events of September 11th would make quite apparent the glaring experiential divide between whites and people of color in the United States. Over the next several months, I would keep track of how many cars I saw with United We Stand bumper stickers and the racial identity of the persons behind the wheels of those cars. Whereas I saw plenty of people of color driving cars with Support the Troops stickers, likely because they had a relative in the armed services, given the disproportionate number of people of color in uniform. I saw literally zero vehicles driven by black or brown folks that sported a sticker proclaiming national unity. I encountered over 500 such cars driven by whites by the time I stopped counting, but none driven by African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, or indigenous persons. People of color know that national unity is not something that we can make real by simply proclaiming it, nor are they likely to think war a sufficient basis upon which to rest a claim for togetherness. Unity requires a unity of opportunity, a unity of treatment, a unity of experience in everyday settings, on the job or in schools or in the justice system. What people of color know and knew, but whites had the luxury of ignoring, was that being attacked by foreign forces had done nothing to bring unity in those areas. The bumper stickers for them would have to wait. The extent to which whites and blacks have almost completely different lenses through which we see the country and the world was made glaringly apparent the night in 2002 when Professor Michael Eric Dyson and I were on Phil Donahue. We were there to discuss comments made by Republican leader Trent Lott, in which he had praised the ARC segregationist Strom Thurmond, suggesting that Thurmond's 100th birthday party, that the country would have been better off had we all listened to Strom back in the day. In attempting to make the point that whites and blacks remember our history differently, Mike noted as an example that although 9/11 had been a tragedy of great magnitude, black folks had known about terrorism for a long time. As he put it, I know a lot of you in here in New York were running for your lives on 9/11, and that was terrible, but my people have been running for 400 years, so what else is new? Immediately, a young white woman in the third row blew up as if he had called her mama by a name. Her agitation got Donahue's attention, prompting Phil to bound over to her seat in his trademark fashion. How dare you compare the experience of Black America with 9/11, she exclaimed, furious that he would have made such a comparison. How dare he? Oh no, sister, Dyson retorted. How dare you compare the events of 9/11 with 400 years of oppression? Don't get it twisted. The ability of whites to deny non-white reality, to not even comprehend that there is a non-white reality or several different ones, indicates how pervasive white privilege is in this society. Whiteness determines the frame through which the nation will come to view itself and the events that take place within it. It allows the dominant perspective to become perspectivism, the elevation of the dominant viewpoint to the status of unquestioned and unquestionable truth. Now, let me stop right there for a quick moment because let me go back to the fact that this book was written in, let's see, this book was written first in 2008. So here we are 8 years later, and I would say the events even today in our country are proving the point of what he calls perspectivism, right? Elevating a dominant viewpoint or the elevation of a viewpoint of the dominant society to the status of unquestioned and unquestionable truth. When you ask white Americans in this country right now, what is going on? A lot of them are very clueless as to why people are protesting. Because in their viewpoint, something great just happened in America. I had someone yesterday, they asked me to give them evidence of Donald Trump's racism and bigotry. No, I'm not your personal researcher. All you have to do is go to Google and type in examples of Donald Trump's racism and bigotry, and you'll find plenty. You'll find a history of it. You'll find videos of him saying things that are racist and bigoted. So there is this kind of parallel universe that many white Americans are living in this country. The exit polls show that whiteness was the unifying factor in him winning the election. Broken down, white wealthy people voted for him. White poor people voted for him. White men voted for him. White women voted for him. White evangelicals voted for him. The common thread there, above all other identifying factors, was their whiteness. Okay? It was a historic, noted moment that for the first time, out of all other identifying factors, white people chose their whiteness above all other identifying factors. Okay? This is researchable. This is not my opinion. So, as he says here, whiteness determines the frame through which the nation will come to view itself and events that have taken place within it. He said this 8 years ago. It was true then, and now we definitely see it's true now. So, you know, this whole idea of a parallel universe or parallel worldviews that people are living in did not just start, last week. It was seen at 9/11 is what he's pointing out. It was seen then with the responses to 9/11. Some people were absolutely horrified and they couldn't understand why any other nation could hate us. And then Black America was horrified, but they had a good idea of why some other nations probably hated us because of the domestic terrorism that has gone on in this country, and it has not stopped. Okay? There hasn't been a time in America where Black people have felt, oh, we can sit back on our laurels and be safe. And anybody that's espousing that is not telling the truth. So there are moments of safety that you feel in this country, but the reality is, especially in the climate that we're in right now, any fool can walk up to you and say something retarded. Because unfortunately, we have now emboldened a segment of the population that hold certain views that people of color don't belong in this country. So I would love for people to deal in truth, but everybody doesn't deal in truth. I deal in truth on my page. So let's keep reading. White reaction to 9/11 reminded me of the white man in his mid-30s who I'd seen on national TV after the not guilty verdict in the 1995 criminal trial of O.J. Simpson, who lamented, "I now realize that everything I was taught in the third grade about this nation having the most wonderful justice system imaginable was all a lie." Now he realized it. He had lived several decades believing the patriotic pep rally propaganda of his teachers, preachers, and parents. But because of OJ, he had concluded that the system might not be fair. He had grown up around people of color. Had he grown up around people of color, they could have set him straight on how the not so wonderful American system of justice was by the time he was 11. But he had had the luxury of believing the lie and then assuming that only the OJ case demonstrated a crack in our system. Everything in this world had been fine until OJ walked in. Then and only then was it as if the world was about to stop spinning on its axis. With the attacks of September 11, the naivety that had begun to crack for whites because of the OJ verdict now lay shattered among the wreckage at the foot of Manhattan. Between the two events, not to mention a string of suburban school shootings that had transpired from the mid-90s until early 2001, which were always met by cries of disbelief that such things could happen in places like that, it had been a tough few years for white denial. The only question was whether or not we'd be capable of learning anything from the truths being revealed. Sometimes the truths that are revealed to us are difficult to accept after all, especially when they tell you something about yourself that you'd rather not face. In April 2003, I boarded a plane bound for St. Louis. From there, I would fly to Iowa for a conference. Prior to that day, I had flown on 1,000 or so individual flights in my life. But as I walked down the jet bridge that morning, I glanced into the cockpit and saw something I had never seen before. In all my years of air travel, not one, but two black pilots at the controls of the plane, a rare sight for any air traveler, considering the small percentage of commercial pilots who are African American. And if you're just coming in, we are reading from White Like Me by Tim Wise, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Given the paucity of pilots of color in the United States, and given what I had at that point, excuse me, been doing professionally for 13 years, one might think that two black men in the cockpit that morning would have been a welcoming sight for me. And upon sufficient reflection, it would be. But upon a mere instantaneous reflection, which is to say none at all, this had not been my initial reaction. Sadly, my first thought, upon seeing who would be in charge of delivering me safely to St. Louis, was more along the lines of, oh God, can these two really fly this plane? Now, don't get me wrong. Well, that's certainly an opinion about it. Now, don't get me wrong. Almost as quickly as the thought came into my head, I was able to defeat it. I knew instantly that such a thing was absurd. After all, given the history of racism, I had every reason to think that these two men were probably among the very best pilots that the airline had. Had they not been, they would have never made it this far. They would have been required to show not only that they could fly, but that they could do so over and above prejudices and stereotypes that blacks have had to overcome in any job they do. I also knew that in the months before this flight, several white pilots had been hauled off of planes because they had been too drunk to fly, or because in the case of two pilots for Southwest, they had decided to strip down to their underwear and invite the flight attendants into the cockpit as a practical joke. The kind of stupid human trick that no person of color would have imagined he or she could get away with. So from a purely rational standpoint, I suppose I should have been glad to see anyone but a white pilot on my plane. But we don't always react to things on the basis of intellect or on the basis of what we know to be true. Rather, sometimes we operate from a place of long-term conditioning, which have penetrated our subconscious, waits for just the right moment to be triggered, and invariably manages to find it. In this case, no matter what I knew, I had been conditioned no less than anyone else to see people of color and immediately wonder if they're really qualified for the job, to automatically assume they aren't as good as a white person. The fact that I've been working on my conditioning and therefore was able to get a grip on my racist reaction is nice, but rather beside the point. All that really matters is that it happened and it could happen again. Maybe it wouldn't happen every time, and maybe it wouldn't happen to you, but the fact is, it could. All it takes is a situation that calls forth the conditioning and prompts the stereotype, and then cues the response. When I first told this story publicly about a year after it happened, other white folks and even people of color responded by sharing their own stories of internalized racial supremacy or internalized oppression. Stories in which they too had reacted to people of color in leadership positions skeptically or nervously, despite their own conscious commitments to equity and fairness. The lesson was clear. Advertising works, and not just for toothpaste, tennis shoes, toilet paper, but also for transmitting racial stereotypes. As I had sat in my seat on the airplane that day, I found myself shaking, not so much because of what I learned about myself, as for what I learned yet again about the way society can distort us. And with Christy expecting our second daughter, the realization was fraught with even more emotion than it might otherwise have carried. No matter what Christy and I would teach our girls, no matter how we would raise them, Ashton and very shortly Rachel would be exposed to the culture's presumptions and prejudice. And once exposed, they too would always be vulnerable and at risk for having presumption and prejudice transform them. We're moving to the next section called Chocolate Rain, Vanilla Indignation. And we are almost done with our reading for today. On August 29, 2005, the city I loved had called home for 10 years ceased to exist. Though it is still there today, something called New Orleans, whatever it is, cannot compare to what it once was. Its zombified transformation to a place neither truly dead nor really alive was accomplished not because of that thing to which we so often refer as Mother Nature, not because of an act of God, however defined, and not directly because of hurricane known as Katrina. New Orleans as we knew it was destroyed by the acts of men. First and foremost, the men who constructed faulty levees for the Corps of Engineers, so that when Katrina came ashore in late August, though it did very little damage to the city itself, the storm surge overtopped and collapsed levee walls in dozens of places, leading to the inundation of roughly 80% of the town. As the news began to filter out that the waters were rising, and as over 50,000 people crowded into the Superdome and Convention Center, which were being used as evacuation facilities of last resort for those who had not fled the city, or couldn't, as there were 100,000 people in New Orleans without access to cars, I sat glued to my television, unable to look away. Most of my friends had been able to get out in days leading up to the storm making landfall, but others had not been so lucky. And I knew that those persons with whom I'd worked in public housing were likely to be trapped. The media broadcast images both enraging and heartbreaking. People stranded on rooftops waiting to be rescued by helicopters, elderly and small children sitting outside the convention center in the scorching August heat with no food, no water, no medicine to provide relief, people wading through waist-deep water to find dry land, their clothes drenched with fetid fluid, mixed with whatever street funk had joined it on its journey downtown. They also showed us endless footage of looters, though it was often the same 5 or 6 incidents shown from different angles, giving the impression to a public already inclined to think the worst of lower income Black folks, the disproportionate composition of those left behind, that theft was more common than it really was. And there were the reports of massive violence as well, murders, rapes, even the killing of small babies, dumped in trash cans according to one report. that these allegations would be investigated and found almost entirely false wouldn't matter. Most people probably never even heard that the violence claims had been debunked by 5 different national and international news outfits. So ready were most people to believe the worst about those who had been left behind. Even fewer would probably learn of the real violence during those days, namely the white vigilante terror squad that formed in the Algiers community on the city's West Bank and shot at least a different dozen African Americans for being in their neighborhood, a story that would not break until 2007, and even then would receive very little media attention. On Tuesday and Wednesday, I spent hours browsing the comment sections of stories posted on NOLA.com, the main web-based news information outlet, which remained operational throughout the crisis thanks to a server located outside of the city. One could read hundreds of hateful, psychotically racist remarks about local area blacks. Commentators took an almost sadistic pleasure in referring to looters as subhuman scum, cockroaches, vermin, animals, slime, and any number of other creative and dehumanizing slurs. Others openly called for the building of a separation wall between Orleans Parish and the much wider Jefferson Parish, if and when the areas were reconstructed so as to keep the animals out of the areas with decent people. One poster discussing those who were looting, even though most were taking necessities like food, water, medicine, or clothes to replace the rotting rags on their backs, wrote in big, angry, unhinged capital letters, "To all police, please kill these insensitive fools. Kill them all. We don't need them on this planet anymore. They don't do us any good. God bless America." The individual who wrote those words was then outdone by another who said, "If I had my way, the National Guard would round these pieces of garbage up, make them clean up the mess Katrina left for us, and then machine gun the whole lot of them into the Gulf. The only good looter is a dead one. There are no exceptions." And then from a commenter who used his real name, Jim Hassinger, so I will too, there was this: "My city is destroyed, and what is left, the bastards are looting. I don't like living here with this disease anymore. I hate you from the bottom of my heart. It's times like these I have to fight racist thoughts." Apparently, Jim was losing that fight. While many refrained from comments of such a vicious nature, they nonetheless showed a disturbing insensitivity towards the suffering of those on the ground in New Orleans, calling them unintelligent for not evacuating. People seemed utterly oblivious to the real burdens of evacuation. If you don't have a car, and you don't have money, and you don't have a place to go, how are you supposed to flee? Some argued that the city should have commandeered school buses to get folks out of town, but there weren't enough people to drive them, or they would have had no clear destination in any event. Unless the federal government mandated that hotels open their doors to the displaced and offered to pay for rooms, which they never did, buses would have had no place to go, and few people would have agreed to just hop on them, drive into the night, and hope for the best. Of course, sometimes when New Orleans did try and flee the city, they were met with hostility and blocked from escaping. On the second day of the tragedy, a group of mostly black residents tried to walk out of the city by crossing the bridge to the west bank of the river, only to be shot at by sheriff's deputies from Gretna who wanted to keep blacks out of their city. And there were, of course, the African Americans on the West Bank who tried to reach the pier in Algiers so as to get ferried out of the area, only to be shot by white terror squads that presumed every black person in the neighborhood was a criminal. Other voices suggested the city should never be rebuilt. Its location, they would say, makes it too susceptible to a similar storm in the future. So it would be impractical to let people return. It's an argument that no one ever makes about small, white, Midwestern farm towns that get blown away each year by tornadoes, or to white retirees in Florida just because they live in a hurricane zone, which many felt was perfectly reasonable in the case of New Orleans and the folks who live there. Whatever compassion and decency had animated the first few hours of the catastrophe on Monday was quickly vanishing by the middle of the week. This concludes our reading for today. What is Tim Wise pointing out? I can tell you, just from my own personal experience of being in Hurricane Andrew and living in the ghetto at the time. I was 13, living in one of the poorest places at the time when Hurricane Andrew struck. And I can tell you from experience that the poor were served last. I'm going to repeat that. During Hurricane Andrew, after Hurricane Andrew was over, the poor were served last. We didn't have a car, so we couldn't just hop in and drive off into the sunset. We didn't have a car. So we were limited, and most of the people around us didn't have a car. We were limited in what we could do in terms of evacuation. The poor people were served last. Water supplies, ice supplies, food supplies. For probably about the first 24 to 48 hours, you were on your own. So one of the things that my grandmother and I, who was later awarded for her bravery in going around and doing this, was we went around and we had a wrench and we went around and we turned on fire hydrants so people could at least get some semblance of water and some semblance to be able to bathe themselves, because help did not immediately come to our area. The National Guard set up at elementary school, and so we were able to get hot meals for several months. But as far as electricity and those kinds of things, as far as receiving financial assistance, that was months later. So we lived for a time in our home with a torn half-piece roof. And, you know, we lived at a point where, you know, because our roof was partially torn, critters and rats and animals could come into our home. Matter of fact, I think my mom was bitten by a rat or something during this time. So again, help for the poor was not first priority. The people who lived in wealthier sections of South Florida received their aid and received their help, and they were able to quickly begin to rebuilding. It was several months before my community received electricity. So for several months, people were barbecuing their food, cooking their food outside, because they didn't have electricity and they were living in the piece of whatever home they still had. They were living in it while waiting for financial assistance because they didn't have money to go somewhere else. So when Tim Wise talks about the disparities between how the poor are treated and how those who have money are treated, I can tell you from experience that that is true. And I told myself that should I ever in life find myself in that kind of position again, that I would try to do whatever I could to help those around me, because I understood and I learned from my own experience how very treacherous and very terrifying it can be to be in a position where you don't have resources, you don't have ways of escaping what could be an inevitable situation like a natural disaster. So today, again, he's pointing out the differences between how poor blacks are treated. He's pointing out the differences between life experiences in our country with black and white people. And some people just, they don't want to hear it. They don't want to acknowledge it. They don't want to talk about it. But we are at a day and an age when we're going to have these conversations. And I like to call them courageous conversations. So this concludes the reading for today. I hope that you will come back tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we do this Monday through Friday, where we are reading, dissecting, and taking a look and reflecting on race. I hope you enjoyed this segment. Hope you learned something and that you will share this video with someone else. Take care. Have a great day, and God bless. Take care. Have a great day, and God bless.